Indeed, the goal of this program was to create Manchurian candidates, individuals who would go out and do whatever they had been programmed to do, including political assassinations, and who would remember nothing about their programming when their assignment was over. There is important and credible evidence that John Lennon's killer, Bobby Kennedy's killer, George Wallace's, and Ronald Reagan's would-be assassins were Manchurian candidates, victims of this kind of mind control. It seems, in fact, that after the fiasco of the murder of President Kennedy, which fooled only 20% of the population, the Manchurian candidate has become the method of choice used by these killers for removing those who get in their way. So what? So these monsters certainly have the capacity, the ability, the means to program people to kill themselves on an airplane full of people. The question is not can they. The question is did they? Well, you be the judge. And ask yourself the question, how likely is it that two different pilots from two different cultures, trained in two different countries with no discernible personal problems, would choose to commit suicide by killing themselves and everyone else on board their aircraft by plunging their planes into the sea on two separate occasions separated by only 50 miles and 100 days? And how likely is it that both pilots, in the midst of their death plunge into the sea, would just coincidentally decide to while away the seconds before their deaths by turning off the fuel to the engines? I can answer that question. It's impossibly unlikely. It is not reasonable to call it a coincidence. Virtually any explanation that doesn't involve fairies or witches would be more likely, more reasonable than the suggestion that it was merely a coincidence. I mean, it's not like they teach you in pilot school that
when committing murder-suicide with your plane and its passengers, don't forget to turn off the fuel valve just in case someone tries to stop you.
But if they don't teach you in flight school, where do you go to learn these sort of sophisticated, cold-blooded, suicidal skills? Oh yeah. It's an obvious point then, isn't it, that the suicidal pilots on both planes were programmed by the same people. We've identified their modus operandi. The fact of these two closed fuel valves on both aircrafts is the smoking gun. It's not only the killer's fingerprints, it's their signature. The monsters who created these mass murderers signed their names with a flourish at the bottom of their artwork. Well, there you are. That's it. We're about at the bottom of this old rabbit hole. And there's not a lot left to do now except to remind ourselves why we came. Why did we come here? What were we looking for? We came here looking for evidence that we were hoping would help us to develop a theory about what happened, and that would help us to answer some of the glaring questions left unanswered by the official explanation, the official theory of what happened. We came hoping to be able to develop a theory that would explain the facts in this case in a manner that wasn't ridiculous. Well, we've done that, I think. Now, the evidence in this case is not complete, but please remember that it doesn't have to be. The evidence proving how the solar system operates would be considered incomplete, incredibly complex, difficult to understand, and virtually unprovable to the ordinary person until the start of interplanetary space travel 50 years ago. Now, if most thinking people didn't accept Galileo's version of the solar system as soon as they heard it 400 years ago, they did accept it as soon as they compared it to the Pope's ridiculous story about giant crystal wheels rolling around inside a giant crystal ball. Galileo's theory of the solar system was based on very, very incomplete evidence, but it explained all of the evidence and it tied it together in a way that made sense. The theory that there was a flight instructor on the plane who was programmed to crash it into the sea is supported by all the evidence that there is, but it is incomplete. For example, at this point I can't tell you the name of the missing flight instructor. Maybe he was a prisoner, or a low-level contract agent, or maybe just some poor slob they dragged off the street and into one of their programming facilities. And the evidence is complicated. But knowing what we know about the forces of evil in this country, it shouldn't really require that much imagination to see this story as the most real and reasonable explanation of the evidence, especially when we compare this theory to the competing theory put forward by the NTSB, that an experienced, skilled, and careful pilot in a reliable aircraft with advanced safety features suddenly and for no apparent reason fell like a stone out of the sky. The NTSB theory can't begin to explain why the FAA ignored phone calls from a senator all night long. It doesn't explain why Bergen's story of radio contact was covered up. It can't explain Rourke's outrageous lies and mischaracterizations or all of the many missing pieces. And it sure in hell can't explain that fuel selector valve. With the theory of the program flight instructor, however, we can explain it all in a reasonable and coherent way. The plan was to commit the perfect crime, to grab the body of their Manchurian candidate, pull him out of the wreckage, and whisk him away, leaving no evidence of their crime. No one could ever possibly figure out how they did it. And they left no evidence, except for the 15-hour delay dispatching the search and rescue craft to the crash site. They must have let Georgie, Dick, and Rummy get involved, and as they have with the economy, energy, post-war Iraq, and Hurricane Katrina, they totally screwed it up. They let the plane sink, and then rather than go with Plan B and just let the flight instructor's body get recovered, they created this outrageous delay, without which this investigation would never have begun. The NTAP location was withheld from the Coast Guard and the Civil Air Patrol from 5 a.m. when it was available until the luggage began to wash up on the shore at 1 p.m. in order to give the bad guys time to recover the body of the flight instructor. Do you doubt me? They were out there. They were seen out there. Listen to this.
Okay. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Stanley of the Civil Air Patrol, we appreciate your talking to us. If Kelly Tuthill is still standing by.
Richard Stanley has been out searching the dry land areas of Martha's Vineyard since 7:30 a.m. He's now speaking at 12:15 a.m. Listen closely.
In case the plane, in fact, had gone down. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Going back to what you said you heard rumors of an NTAP west of
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. I saw the Coast Guard out there. That's the only thing I had that would hint in that direction.
Okay. Yeah, there are reports that there were radar contacts within a few miles west of the vineyard.
Yeah,
so you did see Coast Guard vessels out there searching?
Not vessels, helicopters.
Coast Guard helicopters?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Okay?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sure thing.
Now wait a minute. Stanley is speaking at 12:15 about events he saw early that morning. Admiral Richard Larrabee of the Coast Guard said several times that the Coast Guard did not get the information necessary to begin a focused search until 1 p.m.
And by about 1 o'clock this afternoon, we had narrowed that focus down to an area of about 17 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard.
A few minutes after the interview with Richard Stanley, Todd Bergen, the Coast Guard information officer, said the same thing, that he and the Coast Guard didn't have any radar information.
And that's the last time the plane was heard from.
That is correct.
At approximately 2,500 feet, 10 miles offshore.
That's my understanding. Like I said, as far as that radar location, I do not have that information.
Officer, is there anything that I failed?
Remember at the Pentagon news conference, at about 1:30, Colonel Rourke insisted that despite the radar information, that they were not focusing on one area.
We'll continue on the same track that we're on, which is to search the entire area.
All these people say there was no information that would lead to a focused search of the waters off Martha's Vineyard, and yet Richard Stanley says...
Correct, yes.
Yeah. I saw the Coast Guard out there. That's the only thing I had that would hint in that direction.
Okay, yeah. There are...
No one was focusing on the crash site, but Stanley says he saw what he took to be the Coast Guard conducting a focused search off the west coast of Martha's Vineyard early in the morning. But that's not possible. In fact, just to be clear, the Coast Guard says it wasn't them. But if it wasn't the Coast Guard, then who was it? Well, we have an answer to that now, don't we?